talking about something you're a fan of is a bit like backseat driving, so I'm going to talk about it from the back of a car. This is Backseat Fandom. Today, we're talking about the hit show RWBY from Rooster Teeth. Specifically, we're talking about how the character Ilia is key to, well, Blake and Yang getting together. We'll get into this in a moment. I originally intended this episode to be the first episode of Backseat Fandom. As it is, it'll be going up second because Infinity War happened. I actually have notes for this one, so we're going to see what past me had to say about things. Looks like I'm going to be using some visual aids in this area here. Sounds like a problem for future me. Alright, so, guess we're going to start by talking about the fact that the RWBY fandom is not necessarily unique in the fact that it ships its characters, but it is a bit unique in the fact that there are ships for just about every character you could come up with. And that's, including characters that haven't even shared screen time, like Professor Port and Winter Schnee. There's a ship for it. Alright, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go over some of the characters first, and then we'll get into why Ilia is the key to this ship happening. So, let's start with Yang. We've got my notes here. I'm going to continue to look at my notes. Starting with Yang. So, she's a bit flirtatious, but not with many. She tends to either save that for combat as a distraction. We've seen her do that a couple of times. And she's been flirtatious with, I can think of exactly 2 other characters. Blake, and very briefly with Weiss. We'll go into why that's important here in a little bit. As far as combat's concerned, she flirted with a random White Fang dude, back in Volume 2 with a wink. And she was a little flirtatious towards Junior in her trailer. And that's about it. Although she very much comes off as this flirtatious personality. So it definitely seems like she doesn't have a problem flirting. She's just a little bit reserved with it. She very much cares for her sister, RWBY. That has definitely impacted many of the things in her life. She has abandonment issues. Her mother left her with her father, just unexpectedly. RWBY's mother, went on a mission and never came back, presumed dead. So, there's that there. Ty apparently retreated into himself after the, death of RWBY's mother, and basically buried himself in his work at school. So she was basically left to care for RWBY on her own. She definitely has that issue with being abandoned. At the end of Volume 3, well, we'll talk about post-Volume 3 later, but basically the end of Volume 3 has left her a bit broken, and we'll get back to that because post-Volume 3 is where Ilia comes into play. So, we'll move on to Blake. I like the phrase I put here. Blake, the lonely girl who was never alone. So, she definitely comes off as someone that keeps people at arm's length. And when you know a bit more about her backstory, you can kind of see why. Mainly just because of Adam Torres. And you can kind of tell that is very much becoming an abusive relationship. So much so that the ship for Blake and Adam is called Animal Abuse. So, there's that. So we're going to go into basically her background here and why it's important. She was born into the White Fang. Her father founded the White Fang. She was basically born and raised into it. The White Fang being the real-world equivalent to... well, being the real world... other way around. White Fang is Remnant's version of the real-world Black Panther Party from the 1960s. For those of you unfamiliar, the Black Panther Party started out as a legitimate political movement pushing for equal rights, and very rapidly descended into a might makes right, violent uprising, basically doing exactly the things that the White Fanger, said to do in show, attack shops that wouldn't serve them, that sort of thing. So she grew up on the road with Adam and Ilia. They were her two best friends, basically. She obviously, as per Ilia's observation, had been falling for Adam, so there definitely was something there, at least from her to him, and that's the important part. Now, it does seem that maybe he had some sort of at least possessive feelings for her. He does call her my darling. He does seem upset that she left him. That might just be more of a possessive feeling, though, rather than any sort of actual love. But then again, it may have also just degenerated into that. We don't know. So she eventually ended up making a moral choice to leave the White Fang and them when she decided they were going too far. And, good on her for that. But she immediately enrolled into Beacon, where she ended up meeting Yang and the rest of Team RWBY. So the amount of time she was actually alone was very, very short. So she immediately went from one group of people that she was constantly with to a second group of people she was constantly with. So she has this tendency to run instead of facing her problems. That's what she did with the White Fang. She ran, she just left without really saying anything other than goodbye, and in a way where she couldn't be immediately followed. Running away from her problems there. At the end of Volume 3, she definitely does it again, running away after the events there that happen. She basically apparently stuck around to make sure that everybody was okay and then immediately ran. She was probably doing it to protect them from Adam, but even through Volume 5, she hasn't made that totally clear. It's definitely seems to be what she's thinking, but it hasn't been a clear-cut I left because reason. But we might get that at the beginning of Volume 6, since the team just reunited. She also did this other times in the past too. End of Volume 1, when revealed that she had been in the White Fang, she ran from her team rather than talking it out. Had to get tracked down. She basically had that problem. I mean, she's over and over again run away. Now, Volume 5, she has recognized it and is actively trying to become better, so that's good. However, we're going to have to be suspect about any of her emotional responses about Yang post-Volume 3. Because at the end of Volume 3, she has become guilt-ridden. So anything that could be considered her having romantic feelings for Yang could also just be her having massive guilt for what happened to Yang and feeling responsible for it. So now we're going to go into the ship itself and interactions between them, and then we'll get into why Ilia is the key to it. I know, we're taking some time to get there. But I can't assume that everybody knows everything to the level they need to understand this. So, Yang takes to Blake almost right away. They have a initial encounter the night before initiation, but, obviously not much there. But during initiation, immediately Starts in with the snark. That's kind of her personality. But surprisingly enough, Blake takes the Yang right away, too. They fall into this super easy friendship without even trying. I mean, it's so quick that by the end of initiation, Blake tosses Yang Gamble Shroud, her weapon, in the middle of combat. The one thing that is there, basically her weapon, the thing that keeps her safe and allows her to survive in the face of giant Grimm, no less, passes it to Yang without a second thought. It's kind of a big deal when you think about it. It seems very in the moment, but at the same time, someone who is raised on the road and had to deal with Grimm on a regular basis like this, just passing their weapon off to someone they basically just met, it's a big deal. So, the interaction between the two of them seems to immediately peak in Volume 2. There is a point where Yang pulls Blake aside, has a heart-to-heart with her, opens up about herself. There is very obviously feelings from Yang for Blake. A lot of people will be like, oh, she's just helping a friend. You don't see that coming from her for anyone else other than occasionally RWBY, her sister. So there is most definitely a deeper connection there from Yang's side of things. It's, basically, the other times we see conversations of this nature in the series even, we see Pyrrha having a conversation like this with Jean. Jean having a conversation like this with Pyrrha. Yang and RWBY having a conversation like this. And then in Volume 5, Weiss and Yang have a conversation about it. But they make a point, of specifically having Weiss say that her and Yang aren't as close as Yang and Blake. They make a point of that. It's very much there that even Weiss recognizes that Yang and Blake were close. Alright, so let's see. What else does Past Me have to say about this? Yeah, that Rooster Teeth puts that there for a reason. Okay, so now we got to look at the Blake side, a bit closer at the Blake side of things post-Volume 3. So at the climax of Volume 3, Yang loses an arm protecting Blake. It is a big deal. After Yang loses an arm protecting Blake, Blake runs, presumably to protect them from Adam. And Yang, of course, feels abandoned. I mean, this is immediately noticeable because at the very end of Volume 3, Yang is very noticeably upset that Blake left. To the point where she pushes her own sister away rather than deal with that fact. So there is definitely issue there. Now, it doesn't come up through Volume 4, because Volume 4 is almost entirely, as far as Yang is concerned, about her recovering her sense of self after having a piece of herself removed. Now, Volume 4 for Blake, again, she has many, there's several times where you can see she has feelings about Yang, but they could really be written off as guilt. I mean, I'm a Bumblebee shipper, and I'm saying that, the deep tremble in her voice when she mentions Yang in Volume 4 is most likely guilt. I mean, yeah, it could be exacerbated by the fact that, she has feelings for her. Maybe it's not. Either way, it's most definitely guilt. All right, this brings us to Volume 5. Specifically to Volume 5, Chapter 8. This is a big deal, and this is where Ilia starts to really come into play here. So there are two big moments in this chapter, but there's a few small ones as well. So this is where Weiss and Yang have their heart-to-heart. It's basically Weiss helping Blake deal with her sense of abandonment, especially as it comes to Blake, because it became very obvious to her and RWBY that Yang was having an issue with her feelings for Blake and her sense of abandonment. And Weiss being a good teammate, because nice Weiss is there again, definitely, wanted to go and help. This is, of course, where she also has the comment about how, she's not as close, as Yang and Blake are, but, she's still there for her. And this, of course, this conversation has one of the most heartbreaking lines so far in the series, where when they're talking about Blake and, how Weiss will be there for her when she comes back, Yang says, "What if I needed her here for me?" And it's just a heartbreaking moment. So it is very, very obvious that even despite the abandonment issues that Yang is working through, that she's got deep feelings for Blake. The question really becomes whether or not Blake has the same level of feelings for Yang, or if it's just guilt. So the second big moment is Ilia's reveal, where she, basically comes out as, at the very least, gay for Blake. She is now the lesbian lizard. All right, she, at the very least, has romantic feelings for Blake, has had romantic feelings for Blake, and just kind of kept herself to the side because Blake had been falling for Adam at the time when those feelings developed. Now, what's interesting here, and I may get flamed for some of this, but what is interesting here is that the response that Blake has is not typical of someone who is straight. It is not typical of someone who never thought of having a romantic relationship with someone of the same sex. It is more just kind of a small level of shock because she never thought of that person that way, rather than any sort of instinctual response to, someone that you are totally and absolutely against even the idea of. So it definitely leads us to suspect that Blake might be bi. She obviously had never thought of Ilia as a romantic interest, and she obviously has had some reactions to Sun, so it's kind of leaning towards she's just kind of open to the person. So the chapter overall is about Ilia and Yang and their feelings about Blake. It's literally the two portions of the story that they keep bouncing back and forth between the entire chapter. And Rooster Teeth makes several parallels between the two of them. Now, one of the things that it seems like I've watched a bunch of reactors watch this scene, and something that they all seem to miss is the fact that for pretty much, I think, the first time ever, other than them going completely black when she goes chameleon sometimes, this is really the first time we see Ilia's eyes change. They go from her normal blue to red when she is talking about her feelings for Blake. Exactly the same as Yang's does and specifically about how Yang's does at the beginning of the chapter when she's talking about her feelings about Blake. This is drawing a very obvious parallel between these two, especially since in RWBY, eyes are very important. In multiple ways, eyes have been important in this series. So this is not a minor detail or a mistake on the part of Rooster Teeth. So, let's move on. Towards the end of the volume, when Blake finally gets to Haven and sees the rest of Team RWBY again. She sees the rest of Team RWBY, and her first response is to call out to Yang. I mean, it's not a super call out, it's more of a... It's very much just a immediate emotional response of Yang. Like, everybody else is there, she could have reacted to anything, but it is specifically Yang. Now, this could be because some sort of twisted guilt. She didn't expect to see her in any situation like this more so than any other because of the loss of her arm. But that seems a little complex for a split moment, reaction like what happened. So it definitely seems like she had some measure of needing to say Yang's name more than anybody else's. Alright, so, of course, at the end of the chapter, it is very obvious that Yang accepts Blake back into her life. Of course, things cut out immediately on group hug. So, we're going to have to see where that goes in Volume 6. Now, how Ilia is the key to this. So, bare minimum is that Blake is now in a place mentally where she can recognize that females who she thought were just friends might have feelings for her because of Ilia, because of Ilia's confession, because obviously Blake hadn't thought that way before. So, bare minimum, Ilia has put Blake into a frame of mind where she might recognize basically the feelings that Yang has. Where it goes from there, But bare minimum. This is assuming that Ilia isn't in isn't in Volume 6 at all, beyond maybe a scene at the beginning, because she happened to still be there when the screen went to faded to black. Now, if Ilia sticks around, I think that she is perceptive enough that she will recognize the feelings that Yang has for Blake. And because Ilia is now in a place where she's trying to move forward, she's having her redemption arc, basically, she is likely to say something about it when she sees it. Now, here's the thing. She can say something to Blake, her friend, about how Yang looks at her the way that she used to look at her. Would be a very good line. Very much a thing. She could be the one that directly brings it to Blake's attention. Or, and I think that this would actually be a really good move on Rooster Teeth's part, as a major push forward in Ilia's redemption arc, she could help a human by telling Yang to confess to Blake before it's too late. And I think that saying something along those lines, but like telling Yang to do it before it's too late, would be almost as heartbreaking a line as that "what if I needed her here for me." And this would be a major push forward in Ilia's arc as well, because up till now, yes, technically she came and defended Haven. She broke away from the White Fang. She defended, her friend from the White Fang. Well, that first step, defending her friend and her friend's family from the White Fang, she was still defending a Faunus. She was defending Faunus. Even going to Haven could still be seen as her dealing with a Faunus problem, because the Faunus were attacking. It's going to be bad public image for the Faunus, and the headmaster of Haven, Leo Lionheart, was a Faunus. So they were attacking a school with a Faunus headmaster. This was never going to be some great win against humanity. It was run by a Faunus. So everything she has done so far since the beginning of her redemption arc has benefited the Faunus. This would be a major push forward for her to help Yang, because not only is she helping a human, she is helping a human get something that she herself will never have. And it would be such a major, major push forward that I think that it would be incredibly intelligent for Rooster Teeth to go that direction. Now, once the confession is made, one way or the other, things might go a bit sideways. So, if Blake feels the same as Yang, it's all good. Hooray. Yeah, there might be bumps along the way. I mean, it's a little bit of drama's going to be in any series. That's great. But Blake is obviously still riddled with guilt. She's doing her best not to run away from problems. So, and here's where I might get flamed again. It is entirely possible that Blake might not feel the same for Yang, but decide in her guilt to do penance by being with Yang because that is what Yang wants. And that's a recipe for disaster. So Rooster Teeth might actually end up going that way, although I think they might shy away from that a little bit because they don't necessarily want to anger the LGBT community. But it's a possibility. Now, the other direction this might go is that Blake's guilt might make her feel like she isn't worthy of Yang's love. So she could run away from her problem again, and basically making us all wait for, things to, eventually get there once all the confusion and such is worked out. Waiting for the ship to leave port again, as it were. But I think that Blake might have moved past the runaway stage. Although it is so deep ingrained, it still might happen, and it definitely would be a better way of drawing it out without, angering too many people, So, that's basically the way that I see Ilia being the key to the Bumblebee ship, is her existence as a person who has feelings for Blake, as a female, in some way, shape, or form, is going to make it obvious that the female characters may come together, make it obvious to the female characters that there are people out there other than themselves that have these feelings. And it's real important to remember that back in Volume 2, Rooster Teeth, the crew of, the RWBY, made a statement that there was already at least one character in the show of some flavor of the LGBT variety. At least one. They said they didn't go into exact numbers, but they said at least one. And this is before Ilia was ever introduced as a character, so it is obviously not her. So, someone there in Volume 2, we've got some teachers, we've got our two primary teams, and Team Coffee. Oh, and Team Cardinal, I suppose. And that's really about it, other than Sun and Neptune. Well, these are my thoughts, and that's going to do it for this episode of Backseat Fandom. So, until next time, have a good one.